2012, institutional investors owned fewer than a few 100,000 single-family rental homes across the entire United States. By 2030, analysts at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies project that number will exceed 7.6 million. That is not a market shift. That is a structural replacement. And if you live in Atlanta, Phoenix, Charlotte, Nashville, Tampa, or Austin, it is already happening on your street. Here is what makes this number genuinely disturbing. The average American household earns around $74,580 per year. The median home price in the United States as of early 2024 sits at $417,000. That means the typical American family needs to save for roughly 11 years, putting away every single dollar of income without spending a cent, just to afford the down payment at today's prices, assuming prices hold still, which they will not. Meanwhile, Invitation Homes, one of the largest institutional landlords in the country, generated $2.3 billion in revenue in 2023 alone. BlackRock-affiliated entities collectively hold real estate assets exceeding $330 billion. Progress Residential controls over 90,000 homes. These are not real estate companies in the traditional sense. These are algorithmic acquisition machines operating at a scale no individual buyer can compete with. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to 2008. The housing collapse did not just wipe out homeowners. It produced the largest single-period transfer of residential real estate wealth in American history. Between 2008 and 2012, banks foreclosed on approximately 3.8 million homes. Those properties needed to be liquidated, and banks needed to move inventory fast. The federal government, working through the Federal Housing Finance Agency, created a program called REO-to-Rental. REO stands for Real Estate Owned, the bureaucratic term for foreclosed properties sitting on bank balance sheets. The program allowed institutional investors to purchase these distressed homes in bulk, at discounts ranging from 20 to 40% below market value, on the condition that they rent them out rather than flip them. It was framed publicly as a stabilization mechanism to prevent further neighborhood price collapses. What it actually did was hand private equity firms a land grant. Firms like Blackstone moved quickly. Blackstone's residential arm, which later became Invitation Homes, spent over $10 billion acquiring foreclosed properties between 2012 and 2017. They were purchasing homes in some markets at a rate of more than a dozen per day. They had data infrastructure, legal teams, and algorithmic pricing models that no individual buyer could replicate. They could submit all cash offers within 24 hours, waive inspection contingencies, and close in under 2 weeks. The 32-year-old, first-time buyer showing up with a pre-approval letter and 30 days to close was not competing in the same market. They were competing in a different universe with different rules. Then came quantitative easing. From 2008 through 2022, the Federal Reserve maintained historically low interest rates and expanded its balance sheet to nearly $9 trillion through asset purchases. This created an environment where institutional capital had almost no cost. Borrowing. At 2% to buy an asset yielding 6 to 8% in rental income is not a real estate strategy. It is a carry trade. And the scale at which institutions executed this trade transformed single-family homes from consumer goods into yield-generating financial instruments. The moment a house becomes a financial instrument rather than a shelter, its price is no longer determined by what a local family can afford. It is determined by what a fund manager needs to hit a return target. Those are two completely different pricing mechanisms, and they produce two completely different outcomes for anyone trying to actually live somewhere. The algorithmic pricing layer made it permanent. Companies like RealPage, which at its peak served landlords controlling over 20 million apartment units, built dynamic pricing software that, according to ProPublica's 2022 investigation, allowed competing landlords to share occupancy and pricing data in ways that functionally coordinated, Rent increases across markets. The Department of Justice opened an antitrust investigation in 2023. The damage, however, was already structural. Between 2019 and 2023, median rent in major American metros increased by 26.4%. In Miami, rents increased 51% in 4 years. In Tampa, 42%. In Austin, 34%. These are not inflation-adjusted figures. These are nominal increases on top of the highest baseline rents in American history. Now, meet Daniel. He is 34 years old, lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, earns $96,000 per year as a project manager at a logistics firm, carries a credit score of 748, and has $38,000 saved. By every conventional metric, Daniel is doing exactly what the financial advice ecosystem told him to do. He eliminated his credit card debt. He contributes 8% to his 401k to capture the full employer match. He drives a used car. He does not take extravagant vacations. He is a textbook responsible financial adult. And he cannot buy a home in the city where he works. The median home price in Charlotte as of early 2024 is $389,000. A conventional 30-year mortgage at a rate of 7.1% on that property, after a 10% down payment of $38,900, which already exceeds Daniel's savings by $900, generates a monthly payment of approximately $2,350, not including property taxes at roughly $290 per month, homeowners insurance at approximately $180 per month, and private mortgage insurance of around $215 per month since his down payment falls below 20%. That is a total monthly housing cost of $3,035. Daniel's gross monthly income is $8,000. His take-home after federal and state taxes is approximately $5,120. His housing cost-to-take-home ratio would sit at 51.3%, which is not just above the recommended 30% threshold. It is the threshold at which most mortgage underwriters will decline the application entirely. Daniel cannot qualify for the mortgage on a median-priced home in the city where he has lived and worked for 6 years. So he rents. And his landlord is Progress Residential, which acquired his apartment complex and the surrounding subdivision in a portfolio deal in 2021. His rent increased 9% this year. It increased 11% the year before that. He is paying $2,050 per month to an entity whose parent company manages over $40 billion in real estate assets, and every dollar of that rent is equity he will never see again. Here is the part that matters more than Daniel's frustration. If you are watching this, and you understand the mechanics of what is happening, not just the emotional reaction, but the structural machinery underneath it, you are already thinking about money differently than the majority of people in your social and professional circle. Most people around you experience rising rent or an unaffordable housing market as a personal failure. They conclude they need to earn more, spend less, try harder. They never ask who is on the other side of the transaction and why the transaction is structured the way it is. The people who do ask that question are the ones who find the actual leverage points. If you want to keep getting that kind of analysis, the kind that traces a problem back to its actual source rather than its surface symptom, subscribing to this channel is how you stay inside that circle. Because what comes next in this video is the part that most people never reach. The obvious solution, the one that every housing affordability conversation eventually arrives at, is supply. Build more homes. Increase inventory. Let the market clear. It is the economically correct answer in a textbook, and it is largely useless in practice for reasons that are specific, structural, and worth understanding precisely. First, zoning. Approximately 75% of residential land in American cities is zoned exclusively for single-family housing, which legally prohibits the construction of the apartment buildings, duplexes, and townhomes that would actually increase affordability. Changing zoning requires local government action, which means city council votes, which means political battles with existing homeowners who have every financial incentive to block new supply because their home values depend on scarcity. The political economy of zoning reform consistently produces the same outcome. Proposals stall, projects get delayed, and the supply shortage deepens. Second, construction costs have increased 41.3% since 2019, driven by labor shortages, materials inflation, and regulatory compliance requirements. The cost to build a new single-family home now averages $392,000 in materials and labor, alone before land, before profit margin, before developer overhead. That math makes affordable construction nearly impossible in high-demand markets. Third, even when new supply does get built, institutional buyers frequently acquire newly constructed homes before they reach the retail market. Invitation Homes has agreements with multiple major home builders, including a reported arrangement with Pult Group, to purchase entire communities of newly built homes in bulk. You cannot outbid an entity that pre-negotiated the deal before the homes were built. The system that produced this outcome was not designed with malicious intent at every step. It is more disturbing than that. It emerged from a series of rational decisions made by rational actors pursuing rational self-interest within a framework that had no mechanism to protect the outcome that individual home ownership was always supposed to deliver. The 2008 foreclosure crisis required rapid intervention, and institutional capital was the fastest available intervention. Low interest rates were designed to stimulate economic recovery, and they did. Algorithmic pricing was designed to optimize occupancy, and it did that too. Each piece of the machinery had a legitimate purpose at the moment of its creation. The combination of those pieces, operating simultaneously at scale, produced a housing market structurally hostile to individual buyers. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies found that the national home ownership rate for adults under 35 fell from 43.1% in 2005 to 37.4% in 2023. That decline spans 2 full economic cycles and tracks almost perfectly with the rise of institutional ownership. This is not a coincidence. It is a documented structural correlation. Research from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta found that in zip codes where institutional buyers represent more than 10% of home purchasers, prices rise 7.4% faster than comparable zip codes with lower institutional presence. A 2023 study from the Urban Institute found that renters in institutionally owned properties face eviction filings at rates significantly higher than in individually owned rentals, approximately 68% higher in markets like Atlanta and Phoenix. These are not abstract academic findings. They are the quantified experience of Daniel and the roughly 18 million American households who now rent from institutional entities without knowing precisely who owns their home or what return target drives every lease renewal. So what do you actually do with this information? Not in a vague motivational sense, but in a specific, sequenced, executable way. The first action is geographic arbitrage with a precision filter. Most people think of this as moving somewhere cheap. That is too blunt. What you are looking for is a specific combination. A metro area with a home ownership rate above the national average, an institutional investor market share below 8%, a median home price to income ratio below 4.5, and net population inflow, indicating economic health. Markets that currently meet all 4 criteria include cities like Columbus, Ohio, Huntsville, Alabama, and Spokane, Washington. These are not compromise cities. They are cities where the arbitrage still exists because institutional attention has not yet fully arrived. That window is not permanent. Research from CBRE projects institutional concentration will reach 10% in markets currently sitting at 5% within 4 to 6 years. If geographic relocation is an option for your income type, and remote work has made it an option for a larger portion of the workforce, than at any prior point in history, the calculus deserves a serious spreadsheet, not a dismissal. The second action is understanding the ownership vehicle before you buy. Individual home ownership is one model, but community land trusts, cooperative housing structures, and tenant opportunity to purchase legislation now exist in 31 states. When an institutional landlord seeks to sell a property or a portfolio of properties, these laws grant existing tenants or tenant organizations a right of first refusal, a window to organize a purchase before the property hits the open market. This is not theoretical. The Douglas Community Land Trust in Washington, D.C. has successfully converted 74 units from investor-owned to resident-controlled since 2018 using exactly this mechanism. You do not have to wait for a policy change. The policy already exists. You have to know it exists to use it. The third action is tracking the institutional acquisition footprint in your specific market before you make any housing decision. The SEC requires institutional investors above certain asset thresholds to file 13F reports disclosing their holdings. State property records are public. Organizations like the Private Equity Stakeholder Project and the National Housing Law Project publish quarterly trackers showing which companies are acquiring in which zip codes and at what pace. If you are evaluating a rental or a purchase in a neighborhood where institutional concentration is accelerating, your negotiating position and your long-term equity trajectory look completely different than in a neighborhood where individual owners still dominate. This information is public and almost universally ignored by the people it most directly affects. The fourth action applies specifically to people who cannot or will not relocate and cannot currently qualify for ownership. There is a financial instrument that allows you to participate in the real estate appreciation you cannot access directly, and it does not require accreditation or a six-figure portfolio. Public non-traded REITs focused on residential real estate, combined with publicly traded REITs like Invitation Homes, Avalon Bay, and Essex Property Trust, all available through a standard brokerage account, allow you to place capital on the same side of the table as the institutions extracting rent from your market. This is not a perfect solution. It does not give you the leveraged equity building of ownership, the stability of a fixed mortgage payment, or the control of owning the asset. What it does is redirect a portion of your capital toward the same assets whose appreciation is pricing you out, so that rising values partially offset your exclusion rather than simply compounding your loss. It is asymmetric and imperfect, and it is substantially better than having no exposure at all. The story of institutional real estate is not finished. The capital flows are still accelerating. The algorithmic infrastructure is still deepening. The regulatory response, while beginning to materialize in cities like Minneapolis, San Francisco, and New York, is still years behind the pace of acquisition. By 2030, the projection from MetLife Investment Management suggests that institutional entities could own somewhere between 7 and 12% of all single-family rental homes in the country, concentrated heavily in the Sunbelt metros, where most American population growth is occurring. For Daniel in Charlotte, for the 34-year-old equivalent in Phoenix or Nashville or Raleigh, the window for individual ownership in the city they already live in is contracting in real time. The people who understand the mechanism of that contraction are not helpless. They are just required to act with more precision, more speed, and more information than the generation before them ever had to. And they are required to stop blaming themselves for a market that was structurally reorganized while they were busy doing everything right.